Welcome in, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get right into it. So, two kinds of monsters that we have had for about 100 years now in the modern entertainment zeitgeist are mummies and zombies. Mummies are often thought of when we think of the classic era of Golden Age movie monsters, right? Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, the Thing from the Black Lagoon, all those kinds of classic monsters. Zombies have always kind of been their own thing, though. They've been separate from all of these other monsters. And the different kinds of zombies have led them to almost being their own subgenre of science fiction. Because we've had so many different kinds, there are tons of iterations and stories beyond. Now, mummies, on the other hand, they've kind of fallen by the wayside, haven't they? So much so that we don't really think of mummies anymore. They're more often than not left out of the classic monster conversation, actually. I think mostly because whenever people think of the undead, right, they now think of either ghosts, vampires, necromancers, or zombies. Also, because we haven't really had a lot of modern stories about mummies. I think there are a few reasons for this. Zombies are more mainstream. They're easier to write. They're easier to create origin stories around, right? Like why, if it's a self-contained story, like why those mummies exist. There's either some kind of virus or a chemical outbreak or COVID-30 happens, whatever the case might be. It's really easy to come up with a reason for zombies. And they're more marketable. The implied masses of zombie hordes are a bit more scary because you're often facing down hundreds or thousands of them, and they're wanting to eat your brain or whatever. Although in most zombie stories, they never actually eat all of their victims. They munch on you for a little bit, and then you stand up and join the zombie horde. So you have maybe the original kind of zombies, which you could say were mummies, but the next step in zombies is they would actually like go after your brains, right? And once they devoured your brains, you then became a zombie yourself. But say in The Walking Dead, those zombies, right, they start nibbling on you, and you stand up all chewed up, and you're now a zombie too, and they just kind of leave you alone. So yeah, there's that fear factor, right, of becoming one of the terrifying and rotting and decaying hordes of creatures of more modern zombies. And mummies are a very specific kind of creature, and they do have some conditions for their existence and their actions, right? So mummies are brought about by ancient Egyptian magics and mystic curses. They're in the Mummy franchise with Brendan Fraser. They're brought about with the Book of the Dead, and there's Imhotep, the who is the titular mummy character. Now, the highlight of the differences between mummies and zombies probably iterates why we have endless zombie stories and movies, and almost none about mummies. zombies are given a plethora of reasons for being. They have a gaming franchise built around them, right? They've become incredibly marketable, like I said, especially in the early 2000s and in the late 90s. They had franchises like 28 Days Later and Resident Evil. I don't think that Mummies have had a great shining moment since the Brendan Fraser run of the Mummy movies. They had a reboot which no one really talked about. It happened. People acknowledged that it happened, but I think it was really outdone by the Brendan Fraser Mummy and the sequel. Even the Scorpion King, the two Scorpion King movies that came out afterwards that were kind of in that same Brendan Fraser Mummy universe. But other than that, there've really been no stories with mummies. Now, there are other reasons. Like I said, there are really specifics on how mummies come into being in the first place. And I think that's a point of entry for some exploration, right? It could be different manners of spells or curses. Maybe you have different iterations of mummies found throughout other mythos, right? Like, say, the terracotta warriors. So instead of mummies encased in bandages and these sarcophagus, you have mummies encased in, well, the terracotta statues. And they kind of did that with I think it was the fourth Mummy movie. I think that was it, where they had the ancient Chinese mummy. Yeah, that's it. But again, this is the same franchise. It's really the only thing that's out there for mummies. I'm really going hard on the mummy advocacy, right? The equal representation for classical monsters. Now, like I said, you can make zombies however you want, but I mean, you kind of can't get away from mummies being undead that are risen by means of ancient magics. I think if you skew away from that very niche origin, people will think, oh, well, okay, this is just another zombie movie. And they kind of just write it off as a story that it's not trying to be in the first place. Now, as a staunch supporter of classic monsters, thoughtful and imaginative adaptations and insightful expansions of ideas, I really would love to see more modern literature, shows, and movies with mummies in them. Just to give another great classic monster its due, right? It may be that this one falls by the wayside, and it doesn't make it through the test of time like so many others have done, and I doubt it would really beat out the more modern monsters like orcs and goblins, comic book villains, the eldritch gods and beings like we have with the Lovecraftian monsters like Cthulhu or Hastur, the Man in Yellow. Now, I do think probably the best adaptation for mummies in modern literature or sci-fi culture is definitely the Necrons in Warhammer 40k. But that is even more niche a thing that's geared towards a subsect of sci-fi and nerd culture. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Necrons are these Egyptian mummies, stylized android kind of a race of beings that have a very mystic meets ancient tech style to them. They have a pretty tragic backstory as well. They get betrayed by some deep space gods who the Necrons went to for help, and the gods, the Catan, they agree to help the Necrons by sucking out and eating their souls and reshaping the entire race into a race of soulless, hollow, Egyptian-looking androids that became slaves to the Catan. Now, the Necrons also have a lot of pyramid-style buildings, and their worlds are called tomb worlds, where they're in this deep state of hibernation. It's a lot of fun. It's a really big lore dive if you want to get into it. But I think the greater sci-fi and fictional audiences would love shows or movies that deal with the Necrons. But I think because Warhammer 40k is so niche, and it does take a lot of explanation and lore dumps to really get into, I think that's going to take a long time to become mainstream and popularized. But I think the same for Mummies in general. I think it's a great monster that is ripe for more newer styles of stories, let's say. I think they could be truly terrifying and fun. If you want to really lean into the sci-fi horror genre, right? And I think given the current landscape of horror movies and what's popular, right? The Nun, Smile, The Exorcist, the Annabelle movies. I think true blue horror movies with mummies would actually capture a pretty wide and established audience and would be pretty darn successful. So I definitely think it's something that's needed, these stories, because we do get bogged down for a good number of years in these reiterative or repetitive stories about the same kinds of creatures in what are usually the same kinds of adaptations, right? We get story after story about sexy vampires, right? The serial killers and psychopaths that get turned into good guys. These zombie hordes being cured, and humanity evolving along those who are reclaimed from the horrors of zombification. And I think the Egyptian mythos and the monsters therein deserve more time in the spotlight and in greater variations, often enjoyed by most other mythologies and schools of horror. I mean, we've had a great deal of Greek and Norse mythos in the past couple of decades that just has littered the fictitious landscape with a bunch of variants that have been a lot of fun. But I also think that we could do that same thing with a ton more Asian, African, and Native American mythos and have that populate the fictitious landscape, because the stories therein are equally wild and pretty awesome. Though I do think a great way to open the door for all of those other regions will be revisiting and reopening the interest in Egyptian mythos, beginning with mummies. So I think mummies could be a linchpin here in the how should we say the sci-fi horror, sci-fi fantasy progressive landscape of diving into newer stories and alternative takes on classical monsters. Now, I have talked a lot about zombies. A lot about zombies. Because I think there is a ton to discuss by using zombies as an apparatus. And I think there's a lot of very poignant and relevant conversations to be had by way of zombie stories. But I also think the same can be said by using mummies. Especially because of the differences between the two. And I can't wait for those movies and shows and books just opening paths to all of those stories and conversations. But if you want a really dumbed down explanation between the difference, the difference between mummies and zombies, zombies are brought about by disease or pathogen, let's say a virus. It's usually something that infects a human and then drives it to infect another human, or to consume in order to infect and spread to other human beings. Now, mummies, they are dead. They're preserved, kind of, Egyptian peoples that are brought back by ancient Egyptian magics. And once they're brought back, they typically follow the commands of whoever summons them or resurrects them. And if they're just kind of let loose, then they have no real aim. They're not trying to make other mummies, right? They're not walking around with a bunch of bandages or toilet paper and they're like taking guts out of people and wrapping them up. Although that in itself would be a pretty terrifying story. They're typically like tomb guardians, right? They're cursed to revive themselves and fight off tomb raiders or treasure hunters or gold diggers, whoever. And so on the one hand you have magic, on the other hand you have science. That's kind of a really, really broad and general distinction between the two. And I think zombies have kind of run their course with how many different kinds of ways we can have them. I think there still exists a lot of potential for even more variants of zombies. And I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. I just want to see the same effort being put into different kinds of mummies. That's it. Well, that is all I have time for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stick around for more Sci-Fi Unchained. But for now, live long and prosper, my friends, and may the Force be with us all.